the heck is going on? What a Wednesday it has been over the last 7-8 hours. Caitlin Clark dropping a new colorway, showing us a new colorway. This is the color of your shoe that you should have shown us the first time.
On a single Wednesday, the Indiana Fever organization accidentally revealed everything you need to know about what's really happening with Caitlin Clark. Not through what they said, through what they chose to respond to and what they chose to ignore. 3 stories dropped within 8 hours of each other. A shoe reveal designed to generate buzz. A quiet confirmation that Clark is now on a rotation schedule. And a statement
at Caitlin Clark's new yellow colorway of the Nike Caitlin 1. These are 10 zillion times better than the blue and whites. They pop more. They look more unique. They look crispier. Much better.
Responding to a congressional letter that never mentioned the organization's name. Most people saw these as separate events. They weren't. They were a single window into how an organization prioritizes image management over actual player protection. What's about to be revealed will show you exactly how the WNBA's biggest growth story is being undermined by the people who should be protecting it most. And the most damning evidence isn't what the organization said. It's what they said nothing about. For 3 years, fans watched Caitlin Clark get physically hammered on the court.
Letting us all know, moving on. Aaliyah Boston will be out tonight against the Sparks, and Caitlin Clark will be available, and they'll flip-flop tomorrow for the game against Phoenix, where Boston will be available and Clark will be out. This is load management. This is what they fired Scott Agnes for. In case you guys aren't aware, this is what
The organization's public response was silence. This week, a congressional inquiry arrives with no mention of the team's name, and suddenly the organization has a polished statement ready within hours. That contrast tells the entire story. To understand what happened on this specific Wednesday, you need to understand the context that built up to it. The WNBA is in the most important growth moment in its entire history. Ratings are at record levels. New franchises are coming online. Media companies are competing for broadcast rights. And virtually all of that growth is being driven by...
Yesterday, how did she feel through shoot around, and do you have an update on her status for tonight?
Yeah, she just did some of the shooting. She's going to be out tonight, again with the back-to-back. And Caitlin are back-to-back. Caitlin's going to be active tonight. AB's not, and then they'll flip-flop tomorrow.
What key has been the...
They're load managing.
A single player, Caitlin Clark. Her presence in a game determines whether arenas sell out, whether casual fans tune in, whether sponsorships get value. The league has never been more dependent on one player's availability. But behind the scenes, something uncomfortable has been building. For 3 years, Caitlin Clark has absorbed a...
You don't want to buy tickets to a game not knowing if your favorite player is going to play or if the team is going to have her load manage or she's going to load manage. You don't want to do that as a fan. You don't want to do that. I've used the example numerous times. The Lakers were coming to Brooklyn to play the Nets. I was getting ready to hit purchase. This is like 5, 6, 7 years ago. This is a long time ago. I was getting ready to hit purchase on a ticket sale. I said, you know what? Let me just make sure that none of these guys are load managing. I open up the ESPN app. I come to find out LeBron's load managing, Anthony Davis load managing. It just left a bad taste in my
level of physical play that has been documented and discussed constantly. Fans have watched it happen game after game. The organization has made minimal public statements about protecting her. Coaches have occasionally expressed frustration, but that's been the extent of it. Meanwhile, the team has been dealing with constant injury reports. Clark missing games. The organization managing availability in ways that started to damage fan confidence. And then this week, everything compressed into a single day. The organization's response patterns revealed something critical. They care more about controlling the narrative than protecting the player at the center of it. And that's a problem the entire league is about to have to answer for. Let's start with what happened and then examine why the timing matters more than any individual story. On Wednesday, 3 pieces of news dropped within an 8-hour window. The first was exciting on the surface. Nike revealed a new colorway of Caitlin Clark's signature shoe. A yellow version that looked crisp, that looked better than the original blue and white design, priced strategically at $140, well below the $185 to $210 range you'd pay for comparable signature Jordans. The marketing was smart. The footage dropped of Clark lacing up the yellow shoe right before a game against Los Angeles. It's the kind of content that generates buzz. It's what marketing departments call a win. Fans were excited about it. It gave people something positive to engage with, something fun to argue about on social media. But while that shoe reveal was pulling attention in one direction, the actual substance of the day was moving in another. A beat reporter casually confirmed at Shootaround that the Fever was implementing load management on back-to-backs. Caitlin Clark would play tonight against the Sparks. Aya Wilson would sit out. Tomorrow they'd flip-flop. Wilson would play against Phoenix. Clark would sit out. This was announced with the casualness of a weather report. Stephanie White never used the phrase load management. But when your two franchise players are alternating games on a back-to-back with no new injury designation, the label writes itself. Load management is a practice that poisoned NBA ticket sales for years. It's when a team decides that resting star players during the regular season is more important than delivering the product fans paid to see. A fan planning to attend a game doesn't want to buy a ticket wondering if their favorite player will actually be on the court. It creates uncertainty. It creates risk. And when a fan base has been taught that they need to check the injury report before committing to a purchase, ticket sales start declining. The WNBA has spent 3 full seasons selling itself on one core promise to fans. Buy a ticket, see the stars. Families plan vacations around Caitlin Clark road games. They save money. They coordinate schedules. And then they show up expecting to see the player they paid to watch. Phoenix fans who bought tickets weeks ago for tomorrow's game are now getting a Caitlin Clark-less product with no refund window. They made a purchase based on availability information that has now changed. That's a specific kind of damage that takes time to repair. One burned fan might check the injury report forever before buying another ticket. Some percentage of them stop buying altogether. The business math is brutal here because the WNBA doesn't have the margin for error that the NBA does. The NBA established itself over decades. It has multiple star players in multiple markets. If one team rests players, fans have options. They can watch another game. The WNBA doesn't have that luxury yet. Its growth is almost entirely dependent on one player's gravitational pull. Load management cuts directly against that dependency. But here's where the timing reveals something even more important. While the shoe reveal was generating buzz and the load management confirmation was being delivered casually at Shootaround, a third story was developing. Congress had sent a letter to the WNBA commissioner asking for answers about player safety. Not the Fever specifically. Not Caitlin Clark by name. The letter was addressed to the league office, asking the commissioner for answers about a systemic issue across the entire league. And here's the remarkable part. Within hours, the Indiana Fever released a full organizational statement, responding to a letter that never mentioned their team. Chloe Peterson, the beat reporter who covers the Fever, released a statement saying our organization nor Caitlin have had any interaction with anyone in this congressional group, and we were unaware of the letter. The statement went on to say that the organization has been clear in their public comments about player safety, and that now our players and our fans know where we stand. Read that again. The congressional letter didn't name the Fever. It didn't name Caitlin Clark. It asked the commissioner questions. And the Fever felt compelled to respond within hours. A statement responding to an accusation that wasn't made. An organization defending itself against a letter it wasn't even named in. The contrast is the story. For weeks, a smear campaign allegedly ran against Caitlin Clark in public discourse. The organization's response: silence. Clark reportedly took physical shots on the court that weren't being called. The organization's response: silence, or at most dismissals of fake news. Reports swirled about Stephanie White's job security. The organization's response: minimal engagement. Then a congressional letter arrives that doesn't name the Fever, doesn't name their players, and is addressed to a different building entirely. And suddenly, within hours, the organization has a polished, multi-sentence statement ready for distribution through their beat reporter. Organizations reveal their priorities through response time, quick response to perceived threats to their governance. slow or no response to threats to their players. That asymmetry is the entire story compressed into a single day. The Fever didn't respond quickly because they felt defensive about player safety. They responded quickly because they felt implicated by an institutional failure. The shoe reveal, the load management confirmation, and the congressional response all happened in the same 8-hour window. Maybe that's coincidence. Marketing calendars are set months out. But functionally, the timing worked as counter-programming. Give the fanbase something fun to argue about new shoe colors. Marketing buzz while the harder stories develop underneath. Step back and the picture comes into focus. A franchise that landed back-to-back #1 picks. A fanbase that shows up in historic numbers. A player who has absorbed 3 years of documented physical play. And an organization whose most energetic public communication this week was a rapid response statement to a letter that never mentioned their name. That tells you everything about where the priorities actually are. To understand why load management matters so much in this specific context, you need to understand what the practice actually does beyond just resting players. On the surface, load management sounds reasonable. Sports science is real. Soft tissue injuries spike on back-to-backs. Rotating players across compressed schedules protects them from unnecessary risk. If Caitlin Clark has already missed time this season, if there's a documented history of injuries since Stephanie White became head coach, then rotating her on back-to-backs is a rational protective measure. In isolation, that's defensible. The problem isn't load management as a concept. The problem is implementing load management while simultaneously failing to protect the player from the thing that's actually damaging her body. Here's the fundamental tension that the Indiana Fever organization cannot resolve. You cannot simultaneously claim you're protecting your player while staying publicly silent, as she absorbs the physical treatment that fans have documented for 3 years. If player safety is truly the priority, it's not just a priority in the availability report. It's a priority in press conferences. It's a priority in official statements. It's a priority in advocacy with the league office. It's a priority in standing up for your player when she's being hit in ways that aren't being called. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the organization is treating the symptom while refusing to publicly address the disease. Load management rests Clark's body. It does nothing to address why her body needs so much protecting in the first place. It does nothing to answer the question of whether the physical play she's absorbing is actually acceptable within the rules of professional basketball. It does nothing to support her publicly while the harassment and physical contact continue. This creates a specific kind of psychological message that gets sent throughout the organization and to the player herself. The message is that your body is an asset we need to manage, but your experience of being targeted for physical play is something you need to handle on your own. We'll protect you operationally by giving you rest days. We won't protect you institutionally by standing up publicly and saying that the treatment you're receiving is unacceptable. One is convenient for the organization. One would require confrontation with the league, with other teams, with referees. So the organization chooses the convenient option and frames it as protection. Now let's talk about what load management actually costs from a business perspective. Because this is the part that the WNBA's decision-makers should understand cannot be ignored. The WNBA built its entire growth strategy around Caitlin Clark's presence. Not just as a player but as an attendance driver. Road teams have experienced historic sellouts in arenas that haven't seen full capacity in years. Why? Because families plan vacations around seeing Caitlin Clark play. They coordinate their schedules. They make travel plans. They invest in tickets with the explicit expectation that they're getting to see a specific player. That's not normal in professional sports. That's what happens when a player transcends the sport itself and becomes a cultural moment. The NBA learned this lesson the hard way and had to legislate against it. Load management became so prevalent in the mid-2010s that it started affecting attendance, affecting broadcast ratings, affecting fan morale. Networks and fans eventually revolted. The league had to implement player participation policies that limited teams' ability to rest players on back-to-backs in nationally televised games and games in important markets. They did this because they understood something critical. When fans buy tickets to watch a player who doesn't show up, that's not just one lost game. That's a cascade of damage that unfolds over years. The WNBA is now walking into the identical trap that the NBA walked into, Except the W is doing it years earlier in its growth curve and with far less margin for error. The NBA has multiple stars in multiple markets. Fans in Los Angeles can watch a different game if LeBron is resting. The WNBA doesn't have that redundancy yet. Its entire growth infrastructure is dependent on one player's availability. Here's what happens next based on NBA precedent. A fan buys a ticket to see Caitlin Clark. She's sitting out for load management. The fan shows up, watches a reduced product, feels like they wasted money. That fan doesn't just skip the next game. They start checking the injury report before every purchase. They become uncertain about the value of buying premium tickets. Some percentage of them stop buying altogether. And once a fanbase learns to distrust a team's availability reporting, that trust doesn't come back quickly. There's also a messaging problem that creates long-term damage. When an organization tells fans that load management is about protecting their star player, but simultaneously fails to publicly protect that player from physical harm, the contradiction becomes obvious. Fans aren't stupid. They notice that the organization is more energetic about responding to congressional inquiries than they are about defending their player from documented harassment. They notice that the organization finds time to launch shoe colorways, but doesn't find time to make a public stand about player safety. They notice the asymmetry, and that asymmetry damages credibility. The ultimate irony is that load management might actually be making the problem worse. If Caitlin Clark is sitting out games for rest and recovery, but the reason she needs rest and recovery is because she's absorbing more physical contact than other players, then load management is just managing the symptom while the disease continues untreated. It's like taking pain medication while refusing to treat the underlying injury. It might feel better temporarily, but the damage keeps accumulating underneath. The WNBA can't have it both ways. Either player safety is the priority and the organization protects players from physical harm, or player safety is just a convenient explanation for rest days, and the organization doesn't actually care enough to confront the real issues. The evidence from this single Wednesday suggests the latter. This is where the story shifts from basketball narrative into institutional psychology, and it's the most revealing part of the entire day. A congressional letter arrived asking the WNBA commissioner for answers about player safety. The letter was sent to the league office. It was addressed to Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. It was part of a broader inquiry into systemic issues affecting players across the entire league. It did not name the Indiana Fever. It did not name Caitlin Clark. It did not single out any specific team or any specific incident. It was a general inquiry from a legislative body asking for answers about how the league protects its players. Within hours, the Indiana Fever organization released a full statement responding to this letter. Through beat reporter Chloe Peterson, the organization said, "Our organization nor Caitlin have had any interaction with anyone in this congressional group, and we were unaware of the letter." The statement went on to claim that the organization has been clear in their public comments about player safety, and that our players and our fans know where we stand. Stop there and sit with that response. The congressional letter never mentioned the Fever. The Fever felt compelled to respond. The congressional letter never mentioned Caitlin Clark. The organization released a statement in her name. The congressional letter was addressed to the commissioner in a different building. The Fever released a response anyway through their beat reporter designed for immediate distribution. Why would an organization respond to a letter that wasn't directed at them? Why would they feel the need to clarify that they weren't contacted by Congress when Congress wasn't asking them? Why would they rush out a polished statement when they could have just not responded at all? The answer reveals everything about how the organization thinks about its role and its vulnerabilities. Organizations reveal their priorities through response time. That's not some obscure principle. That's observable reality that applies to institutions across every sector. Quick response indicates perceived threat and concern about reputation. Slow or no response indicates either genuine unconcern or a conscious decision that the issue isn't worth prioritizing. The Fever's response time to the congressional letter tells you that they perceived a threat. But the letter didn't threaten them. It questioned the commissioner. So why did they feel threatened? The answer is that the organization felt implicated. When Congress starts asking about player safety in women's professional basketball, and that question comes on the heels of 3 years of documented physical play against one specific player, and that player happens to play for your organization, you're going to feel implicated even if you're not explicitly named. The organization understood the subtext of the congressional inquiry, even if it wasn't directed at them explicitly, and that subtext was about exactly what they failed to address. Now contrast that speed with the organization's response to other things. A smear campaign ran against Caitlin Clark for weeks in public discourse. The organization's response: silence or dismissals of fake news, or at best minimal engagement. Fans documented Caitlin Clark being hit in ways that weren't being called. The organization's response: silence, punctuated by occasional statements from the head coach expressing frustration, but no organizational advocacy for rule changes or league action. Reports swirled about Stephanie White's job security and the organization's direction. The organization's response: more silence or defensive statements about fake news narratives. Then the congressional letter arrived, and suddenly the organization had a statement ready within hours. The speed of that response compared to the silence that preceded it is the most revealing data point about organizational priorities. The organization cares more about being implicated in a systemic problem than it cares about protecting its player from the systemic problem itself. Think about what this says about institutional psychology. The organization prioritizes protecting itself from the appearance of complicity above actually protecting the player from the conditions that made complicity possible. The organization was fast to respond to a threat to its reputation. It was slow or silent when responding to threats to its players' physical and psychological safety. That's not accidental. That's intentional prioritization. That's an organization that understands reputation management better than it understands player protection. And that's a problem that cascades through everything else. There's also something telling about the content of the statement. The Fever said the organization and Clark were unaware of the congressional letter. Fine. Nobody claimed they should have known in advance. But then the statement said they've been clear in our public comments about player safety. Have they? The public record shows Stephanie White expressing frustration in a single post-game press conference. That's the organizational public record on defending Caitlin Clark from the physical play she's absorbed for 3 years. One press conference. One moment. That's what the organization considers being clear about player safety. The statement also said that our players and our fans know where we stand. But that's precisely the problem. A position you never articulate publicly isn't a position. It's an alibi. You can't claim to have a strong stance on player safety and then remain silent for 3 years while your player absorbs documented physical treatment. The claim that players and fans know where the organization stands on safety is contradicted by the organization's own public record of minimal engagement on the topic. The speed of the congressional response wasn't because the organization suddenly became energized about player safety. It was because the organization felt legally and reputationally exposed by a congressional inquiry. And that distinction matters because it tells you what the organization actually cares about protecting. It's not Caitlin Clark's safety. It's the organization's reputation and legal standing. To really understand what's happening, you have to look at the organization's actual public record on defending Caitlin Clark from the physical play she's absorbed. And that record is stark. For 3 years, fans have watched Caitlin Clark get repeatedly hit in ways that weren't being called as fouls. This isn't speculation. This isn't debate about basketball philosophy. This is documented on video, repeated enough that it became a consistent topic of conversation across sports media and fan communities. Fans created compilations. Analysts discussed it. The conversation wasn't whether it was happening. The conversation was why it was being allowed to happen. And through all of that, what was the Indiana Fever organization's public response? Mostly silence. Occasionally, Coach Stephanie White would express frustration in a post-game press conference about refereeing decisions. One press conference where she talked about the need to do better. That's the organizational public record. One moment of explicit frustration across 3 years of documented physical play. For a player who generates the league's growth, who carries the franchise's future, who absorbs constant harassment online and physical contact on the court, the organization's public advocacy was minimal. Meanwhile, what the organization did talk about publicly was mental toughness, handling criticism, dealing with hate online. The message that got amplified was that the player needs to be strong enough to handle the environment rather than the organization being strong enough to change the environment. That's not supporting a player. That's externalizing the problem. It's saying the environment is fixed and the player needs to adapt to it, rather than the organization adapting to protect the player. Consider what that does to a player's psychology. You're getting hit constantly on the court. You're getting attacked online. And your organization's message is that you need to be mentally tough enough to handle it all. The subtext is clear. We're not going to do much to stop this, so you need to get better at living with it. That's not support. That's blame transferred to the player for not being strong enough to manage a situation the organization isn't willing to address. The organization also claimed in their congressional response that they've been clear in our public comments about player safety. But here's the thing. A press conference comment from the coach isn't organizational clarity. It's a moment. Organizational clarity requires consistent, repeated, public advocacy. It requires statements. It requires action. It requires the front office and the owner and the organization as a whole making clear that player safety matters more than maintaining the status quo. That's not what the Fever has done. What the Fever has done is manage the availability of the player operationally, while failing to manage the conditions that require that operational management. They've said, "We're resting our star player because we care about her health," without saying, "We also think the physical play against her is often unacceptable, and we're advocating for rule changes." They've done one without doing the other. And that's the contradiction that makes fans and observers rightfully suspicious of the organization's actual priorities. There's also something revealing about what the organization didn't say. They didn't publicly defend Caitlin Clark against the smear campaign that ran against her for weeks. They didn't make statements condemning the harassment. They didn't stand up alongside their player and say, "This is unacceptable and we're supporting our teammate." They let her navigate that alone, publicly. Meanwhile, they made statements defending the head coach's job security. They responded to narratives about the organization's direction. They engaged with stories about themselves. But when it came to standing up for their player, the organization was largely silent. That asymmetry matters because it sends a message to the player about where she sits in the organization's priorities. The organization will engage in reputation management on behalf of its coaches and its structure. The organization will defend itself against narratives that threaten it. But the organization's player? She handles her own battles. She manages her own mental health. She absorbs the physical contact and the harassment and the lack of public support. And she's told that doing so gracefully is what being mentally tough looks like. One fan comment summarized it perfectly. "For 3 years, people have watched Caitlin get hammered on the court in the name of physicality. And for 3 years, the organization's primary public message has been about the player's mental toughness, rather than the organization's failure to protect her." That's the actual public record. That's what fans have experienced. That's what the organization's silence has communicated more loudly than any statement ever could. The organization's claim in their congressional response that, "Our players and our fans know where we stand on player safety," is contradicted by the organization's own 3-year public record of minimal engagement on the issue. Fans don't know where the organization stands because the organization hasn't clearly told them. All they know is what the organization hasn't done. And what it hasn't done is make protecting Caitlin Clark from physical play a priority in their public advocacy and their organizational actions. This is the fundamental question that the entire situation comes down to, and it's the question that determines everything about what comes next. Does the Indiana Fever organization protect Caitlin Clark? Or does it protect itself from Caitlin Clark's situation? Those are two different jobs. They require different skills. They require different priorities. And they produce completely different outcomes. The evidence from this single Wednesday suggests the organization is doing one job really well and completely failing at the other. Let's define what protection actually looks like. True protection means publicly defending your player when she's targeted, advocating with the league for rule changes that affect her safety, being willing to confront other teams and referees about standards, standing alongside your player through difficult moments, making clear through your actions and statements that the player's well-being matters more than image management. Load management could be part of that protection. Resting a player on back-to-backs is fine if it's part of a comprehensive approach that also includes public advocacy and institutional support. But load management alone, without the rest of that infrastructure, isn't protection. It's symptom management. It's treating the fever without treating the infection. Now let's define what self-protection looks like. Self-protection means responding quickly to threats to organizational reputation, managing narratives that might expose the organization to criticism, defending coaches and structures rather than players, staying silent on issues where speaking might complicate the organization's position, prioritizing image management above player well-being when those things conflict. The evidence from Wednesday suggests the Fever organization is exceptionally skilled at self-protection. The speed and polish of the response to a congressional letter that didn't name them. The careful framing of load management as a safety decision, rather than an acknowledgement of systemic failure. The selective engagement with narratives responding quickly to threats to organizational structure, while staying silent on threats to player well-being. All of that indicates an organization that has invested significant resources into managing how it's perceived. But here's the problem that the organization can't solve. When a player has absorbed 3 years of documented physical treatment, without public organizational support, load management doesn't suddenly prove the organization was protecting all along. It reads as late-stage damage control. It reads as trying to protect an asset that the organization failed to protect when protection mattered most. It reads like the organization is trying to protect itself from accountability by finally appearing concerned about the player's well-being. Fans understand this distinction intuitively. That's why the response to the load management announcement was skepticism, rather than appreciation. Fans saw an organization that had been silent for 3 years suddenly implement rest days and thought, where was this protection when she was being hammered on the court? The organization's timing undermines its claimed motivations. If player safety was always the priority, why does it look like an afterthought now? This also reveals something about institutional psychology that goes beyond basketball. Organizations that prioritize self-protection over actual protection tend to double down on the approach when challenges emerge. They respond faster to threats to their reputation. They invest more in narrative management. They become more defensive. That's what we've seen from the Fever this week. A congressional letter that doesn't mention them, and suddenly the organization has a statement ready. That's not the behavior of an organization confident in its player protection infrastructure. That's the behavior of an organization nervous about being implicated in a systemic failure. The stakes here are higher than just this one organization. The WNBA is in the most critical growth window in its history. The league's entire future depends on maintaining fan confidence that they're investing in something real and sustainable. When the biggest franchise in the league appears to be prioritizing self-protection over player protection, that damages confidence. When the league office watches an organization respond to a congressional inquiry faster than it responds to player safety concerns, that raises questions about what the league values. And when fans see that asymmetry, some percentage of them start questioning whether their investment in the sport is actually going to players who are protected and valued. There's also a moral dimension here that matters beyond the business metrics. A player who enters a league with the potential to revolutionize it deserves more than load management, while the organization stays silent. She deserves an organization that stands alongside her publicly, that advocates for her safety, that's willing to confront the league, other teams and referees when the rules aren't being applied fairly. That's what genuine protection looks like. Load management without that context isn't protection. It's just managing the asset. The organization's choice this week to respond quickly to a congressional inquiry, while staying relatively silent on documented physical play, makes clear what it values more. It values being implicated in systemic problems, less than it values defending a player who's experiencing them. And that choice tells players in the league everything they need to know about what they can expect from their organizations. Don't expect public advocacy. Expect operational management. Don't expect institutional support. Expect that you're responsible for managing your own well-being in an environment your organization won't fundamentally change. That's a message that travels fast through locker rooms. And that's a message that affects who wants to play in the WNBA and under what terms. The question now isn't really about one rest day or one press release or one shoe colorway. Those are symptoms. The actual question is whether the WNBA can continue growing at the pace it's been growing when the league's entire growth model depends on one player, while the system protecting that player is visibly broken. The congressional letter was significant not because it was targeted at the Fever, but because it represented a moment where institutional scrutiny shifted from media and fans to elected officials. Congress asking questions about player safety means the issue has moved beyond the sports world. It means there are people in positions of authority who see a problem that needs investigating. That's a threshold the league cannot cross and then pretend nothing happened. Congressional inquiries create accountability mechanisms. They create paper trails. They create a public record that's harder to manage away. The Fever's rapid response to the congressional letter was actually revealing, because it showed nervousness about being implicated. If the organization was confident in its track record on player safety, it wouldn't have felt compelled to respond to a letter that didn't name it. The response itself is evidence that the organization understands there's a problem it hasn't adequately addressed. And that understanding, combined with the public silence on the actual issues, creates an incredible amount of tension. What the league office has to do going forward is clarify what player safety actually means operationally. It can't be just load management. It can't be just statements. It has to include clear standards for what constitutes illegal contact, accountability for referees who don't enforce those standards, investigation and consequences for systematic physical play, public organizational support for players experiencing targeted contact, removal of the implicit understanding that physical play against young players is part of initiation. The WNBA learned early that one player can carry an entire league. The league's growth is Caitlin Clark's growth. But that creates an incredible amount of fragility. If that player gets broken down by the system, if she starts believing that the league and her organization don't actually protect her, if she decides that the cost of playing is too high, the entire growth trajectory of the league changes. That's not just about losing one great player. That's about losing the momentum that brought millions of new fans to the sport. There's also a precedent issue that the league has to think about. Agents for other young players will be watching how this is handled. They'll be watching whether organizations actually protect their players or whether they just manage the appearance of protection. They'll be advising their clients accordingly. If the league establishes that young players get used as sacrificial assets in the pursuit of mental toughness, that affects recruitment. That affects what kind of talent comes into the league. That affects the long-term growth potential. The fan response is also going to matter in ways the league might not fully appreciate yet. The people who bought tickets expecting to see Caitlin Clark and got load management instead won't just stop buying Fever tickets. Some of them will start questioning whether the league is actually a good investment of their time and money. That matters for the new media rights negotiations. That matters for attendance across the league. That matters for the growth narrative that's been driving expansion and investment. What probably happens next is a period of managed response. The league might commission a study on player safety. There might be statements about doing better. There might be rule changes that look like they address the problem while actually changing very little. The organization might reduce the visibility of load management or reframe it differently. The narrative will shift, and without a new flashpoint, the intensity of scrutiny might decrease. That's the typical institutional response to pressure. But something has changed this week that can't be unmade. The congressional inquiry puts a formal spotlight on the issue. The organization's unequal response times revealed their actual priorities. The fan skepticism about load management without public protection shows that people aren't buying the framing. And the accumulated 3-year record of documented physical play without organizational public defense is now permanently in the historical record. The WNBA also can't ignore the fact that its entire growth strategy is dependent on maintaining fan confidence. And fan confidence is built on the belief that the league and its organizations actually care about protecting their players. The moment that belief is damaged, everything gets harder. Marketing becomes harder. Ticket sales become harder. Broadcast ratings become harder to grow. You're no longer selling fans on the promise of growth and opportunity. You're selling them on the fear that everything could collapse if they don't buy tickets now. What the league needs is for the Fever organization to demonstrate that it actually protects Caitlin Clark. Not through load management. Not through statements responding to congressional letters. But through consistent public institutional support when she's being targeted physically. Through advocacy for rule changes that affect her safety. Through standing alongside her in moments when she's being attacked or questioned. Through making clear in every interaction that player protection is the top priority, above image management, above conventional wisdom, above everything else. If the organization can't do that, if it continues to choose self-protection over player protection, then the underlying issue doesn't get solved. And if the underlying issue doesn't get solved, then one player's declining confidence in the system cascades into broader questions about whether the WNBA is actually a sustainable institution for female athletes. That's the real question being asked this week, even if it's not being asked directly. And that's the question the league and the organization have to answer through their actions going forward.